I've listened to the debate here, and it's been very, very instructive. We've all seemed to struggle with this definition of community banks that weren't part of the problem during the crisis in 2008 and beyond, and the banks that needed regulation. There's a great article from this past Sunday by Gretchen Morgensen, who is a continual source of wisdom on these matters. It's entitled "Regulatory Relief for Banks That Really Fail," and she talks about a proposal by Tom Hennig. He's a vice chair over at FDIC, and he has a very simple plan, and it addresses the concerns from the gentleman from New Mexico and Oklahoma and Georgia. He comes up with 4 criteria that really based on the complexity of the bank, based on the risky behavior that they have. The regulatory framework falls more heavily on those, but frees up the regulatory framework for local community banks that don't engage in risky behavior. And quite simply, I'll just tell you what they are. He says that banks that hold no trading assets or liabilities, banks that have no derivatives positions other than plain vanilla interest rate swaps or foreign exchange derivatives that get traded up front. There's no looming deadline there. No leverage. Finally, banks whose notional value of all derivative exposure is less than $3 billion. And fourth, banks whose shareholder equity or net worth is at least 10% of assets. Now, when you apply that criteria to commercial banks, out of 6,500 commercial banks in this country, only 400 are covered under the regulations. 6,100 are exempt, basically. When you look at the complexity of banks, the great majority of the banks that we're talking about are traditional banks. And so he also talks about the relief we could offer them. He talks about the fact that Ms. Eberly and Ms. Hunter, that we could stretch out the examination period for non-risky banks, community banks, from every 12 months to every 18 months. So you're only doing 2 examinations every 3 years instead of 3. He talks about the relief under the Basel capital standards. We could exempt a whole lot of our banks from that standard. He talks about there are only 18, he identified 18 banks with total assets of $10 billion that would also qualify. So it's not just small banks, it's big banks that don't do risky things that would be helped by his proposal as well. He also talks about the fact that in these simple cases for community banks, FDIC and other regulators could do the stress tests themselves rather than requiring our banks our local banks to engage in a very costly process. And as far as that 10% of net worth to assets, the vast majority of our community banks that you oversee, are already in compliance. And a bunch of others are right on the bubble. They could get into compliance if they chose to do so. So and Tom Hennig is someone who's concerned with the stability of our banks and making sure that banks are sound. And so I've actually asked my staff, we're in the process of putting together legislation that would comply with all that. Ms. Eberly, what do you think about that? Without the benefit of having read his proposal, of course.
The Vice Chairman's proposal, it does suggest a risk-based approach to regulation, and that aligns with the approach that we already take to risk-based supervision, risk-based assessments for our deposit insurance pricing, and risk-based regulation and guidance. So I think it's consistent. I think it's a policy call for Congress. I think we've already indicated a willingness to talk about a simpler capital approach for community banks.
Great.
The definition we use of community banks does incorporate some institutions over $10 billion by using. We have a different way of applying kind of the risk characteristics.
Okay, I want to give Ms. Hunter a crack at this as well. Ms. Hunter?
Well, I agree with all the comments that Ms. Eberly made in terms of the risk-based approach. I would add at the Federal Reserve we are considering how the agencies might be able to do some simplification consistent with the Collins Amendment and other sound prudential practices, particularly with respect to the capital proposals that he's put forth.
Okay.
But I haven't studied the whole proposal.
Just in closing, I just want to say that the gentleman from New Mexico pointed this out, as well as the gentleman from Oklahoma, that this regulatory burden is causing consolidation. It's squeezing, it's forcing banks to merge and putting some of our community banks out of business. So we got to figure out a solution here. And I think that, with all due respect, Mr. Hennig's proposal in trying to define where that line is drawn is one of the best proposals that I've seen. And I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman.